That's the wrong formula, the waitress murmured to the billionaire just before he finalized the $100 million agreement. What if a single quiet warning could shift everything you believed about success? Margaret Chen had been pouring coffee at Mickey's Diner for 37 years, watching powerful men in polished suits seal deals over her homemade apple pie. She'd witnessed fortunes gained and lost across those fading vinyl booths, but she'd never dared to interfere until that Tuesday morning, when Richard Caldwell, the pharmaceutical tycoon, spread his papers across table 6. Her steady hands trembled slightly as she topped off his coffee, recognizing the chemical formula scribbled in his tidy handwriting. It was incorrect, dangerously incorrect, the same kind of mistake that had taken her husband 2 decades earlier. Richard was about to sign a multi-million-dollar deal based on research that could harm countless people. And Margaret was only a waitress. But sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected voices. Richard hadn't always lived as a billionaire. Growing up in a small Iowa town similar to the one surrounding Mickey's, he learned hard work from his father, a local doctor who treated patients whether they could pay or not. Those lessons had shaped Richard's vision when he founded Caldwell Pharmaceuticals 40 years ago, intending to make life-saving medication affordable. But somewhere along the path, between board meetings and rising profits, he'd lost sight of that simple dream. This morning's meeting was meant to be the crowning moment of his career. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, his lead researcher, sat across from him in the corner booth, her laptop displaying the final clinical trial data for their new heart medication. The quiet diner had been Richard's idea. He wanted privacy away from corporate towers and watchful competitors. Mickey's, with its worn, checkered floors and comforting smell of bacon, reminded him of the diners from his childhood. The trials exceeded every expectation, Elena said, barely containing her excitement. If we secure FDA approval, this could transform heart treatment for millions. Richard nodded and studied the formula she'd written on his notepad. The drug would be their most profitable yet. Manufacturing was already arranged with Bright Star Industries, a $100 million deal that would push the medication into the market within 6 months. Margaret had noticed the luxury cars lined outside when she arrived for her shift. After nearly 4 decades at Mickey's, she'd developed an instinct for important meetings. The silver-haired man carried himself like someone used to being obeyed, and the younger woman beside him had the focused air of a scientist. She'd once been a chemistry teacher, before life shifted her plans, before her husband David's illness drained their savings and forced her into whatever job she could find. As she walked toward their table with the coffee pot, pieces of their conversation reached her. Heart medication, clinical trials, molecular structures. Her pace slowed when she saw the formula. It was familiar. Too familiar. Her grip tightened as memories resurfaced. David in the hospital bed, trusting the doctors who prescribed an experimental heart drug. Almost the same compound structure, just arranged differently. The same early promising results, the same catastrophic effects no one predicted. "More coffee?" Margaret asked softly, keeping her voice steady. Richard looked up with the distant politeness of someone accustomed to being served without noticing who served him. She refilled his cup, her eyes drifting again to the formula. The arrangement was wrong, not obviously, but subtly, in a way that would only reveal itself after months of use. She'd spent years studying David's case, speaking to specialists who explained the chemical interactions that eventually stopped his heart. Elena was already dialing her FDA contact to fast-track approval. Richard lifted his pen, ready to sign the manufacturing contract. In moments, the formula would be locked into production permanently. She hesitated. She was just a waitress. Who would take her seriously? Who would trust the concerns of a 70-year-old woman in a coffee-stained apron over a billionaire and his team of scientists? But she remembered David's final words. Promise me you'll speak up when it matters." The weight of that promise rested heavily on her. She slipped into the kitchen, heart pounding. From the service window, she watched Richard and Elena discussing distribution plans, their excitement growing. She'd faced this choice once before, when David first began experiencing irregular heartbeats that doctors dismissed as stress. She doubted the medication, researched the compound herself, but she'd been younger then, less confident. Trust the experts, people had told her. What do you know about medicine? The regret still haunted her. But now, she wasn't questioning a prescription for one man. She was looking at a formula that could affect thousands. She quickly called Dr. James Morrison at the university, the one researcher who had spent months analyzing the compound that killed David. If anyone could confirm her concerns, it was him. When he answered, she whispered, "I need your help with something urgent." She described the formula while watching Richard organize his documents through the window. After a long silence, Dr. Morrison asked her to send a photo. Hands shaking, she pretended to wipe the counter near table 6 and snapped a discreet picture. 5 minutes later, his voice returned, grave and certain. "You're right to be concerned. That molecular arrangement is nearly identical to the compound that killed David. The small modification they made could even worsen the long-term effects. It might hide early symptoms until it's too late." Margaret stared through the window at Elena showing Richard projected profits, hundreds of millions in revenue, thousands of jobs, a medical breakthrough that would solidify Richard's reputation. But all of it balanced on a mistake that could lead to tragedy. She dried her hands on her apron, gathered her courage, and stepped out from behind the counter.
"Excuse me," she said gently. Richard looked up, irritated at first, then polite when he saw her lined face. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I noticed your formula," she said quietly, nodding at his notepad. "I believe there might be a problem." Elena's fingers froze over her phone. Richard set down his pen. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" His tone was controlled, but edged with impatience, the same tone experts had used to dismiss her concerns years ago. "The molecular structure you've written," Margaret said more firmly. "I've seen something almost identical before. It didn't end well." She pulled out her phone and showed them David's medical records, the same structure with only slight differences. "My husband died from a medication like this 20 years ago." Richard's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but this formula has been extensively tested. We've invested millions in research." Margaret felt the old weight of dismissal, but this time she didn't step back. "I taught chemistry for 15 years. I spent months studying my husband's case with specialists. This compound creates a delayed cardiac reaction. The symptoms don't show until it's too late." "That's impossible," Elena argued. "We followed patients for 18 months. We would have seen complications." But her voice faltered as she looked again at the formula. Margaret pulled a worn folder from her purse. David's records, research notes, doctor correspondence. She had carried them for 20 years, without knowing why. Now she did. "My husband's medication was approved after 18 months too," she said, laying the documents on the table. "The heart issues didn't appear until month 22. Richard stared at the documents, uncertainty finally breaking through. He built his empire on data, but something in Margaret's eyes reminded him of his father, the conviction that comes from witnessing real suffering. "Even if you're right," he said slowly, "we're talking about a $100 million deal, thousands of jobs, patients waiting for treatment." "I know," Margaret said quietly, "but what if you're wrong? Families could lose someone they love because no one asked harder questions." Elena closed her laptop. "What do you suggest we do?" "Extend the trials," Margaret said steadily. 6 more months. Test specifically for the markers in my husband's case." She slid a research paper toward them. "Dr. Morrison documented everything. He'll help." Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. The Brightstar deal expired in 48 hours. If he backed out, they'd hand it to his biggest competitor. "You're asking me to risk everything," he said. "I'm asking you to risk money to save lives. The same choice your father made every day." Richard froze. He'd never mentioned his father to her. Margaret smiled softly. "He delivered my daughter 43 years ago during a blizzard. Never sent me a bill." Elena studied the documents. "These enzyme markers, we didn't test for this combination." Recognition dawned on her face. Richard walked to the window, staring at his reflection. He saw his father's face layered over his own, the man who died with little money but enormous respect. When had he lost sight of that? "There's something else," Margaret added. "The university now has advanced testing equipment. They can run full cardiac simulations in 6 weeks." Elena looked up, almost relieved. She's right. Dr. Morrison's work is highly respected. Partnering with him could actually strengthen our FDA submission. Richard turned back to Margaret, not seeing a waitress, but someone who carried 20 years of knowledge that could save lives. "What you're asking, it's not just about the drug, is it?" "No," Margaret whispered. "I'm asking you to remember who you meant to be." Richard picked up his phone, not to call Brightstar, but to call Dr. Morrison. 6 months later, Margaret was wiping down table 6 when she saw the familiar silver Bentley pull into the parking lot. She smiled and reached for the coffee pot as Richard walked in, this time with a young woman who shared his determined chin. "Margaret," Richard said warmly, "this is my daughter Sarah. She's our new director of patient advocacy." Sarah shook Margaret's hand with genuine respect. "Dad's told me everything about how you saved countless lives." Margaret blushed. She'd only done what David would have wanted. Richard spread new papers on the table, letters from patients and families. "The extended trials confirmed everything you warned us about. We redesigned the compound completely. It took 8 extra months and cost us the Brightstar deal, but we made something safer." Elena joined them, not as an employee, but as Richard's partner. "We published a study on the dangers of the original compound. 3 other companies abandoned similar formulas because of your husband's case. David's story is saving thousands of lives." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. For 20 years, David's death had felt senseless. Now, somehow, it had meaning. "There's more," Richard added. "We're creating the David Chen Foundation for Medication Safety, independent testing, patient advocacy, and research. We want you on the board." "I don't know anything about running a foundation," Margaret whispered. "You know the most important part," Sarah said. "You speak up when it matters." Richard took Margaret's hand. "Thank you for whispering the truth when everyone else was celebrating. Thank you for reminding me who I wanted to be." Margaret tucked the foundation letter into her apron beside David's wedding ring. Tomorrow, she'd begin a new chapter. Tonight, she'd go home and tell David all about it, the way she always did, knowing he'd be proud that she finally kept her promise.